Okay, thank you very much, Heba, and welcome, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to have this chance to share with you some ideas. Ahmed asked me to talk about social justice around the world, in other parts of the world than the MENA region, since I was new to the MENA region. But what I'm finding is, of course, that social justice in other parts of the world are not that different from the MENA region. And they suffer from many of the same problems. Now, the reason why we were even discussing this subject is that around the world, countries, for various good reasons, establish in their constitutions a variety of rights to education, rights to health, universal rights to health, rights to water, and a whole lot of others. And there's dozens and dozens of countries that have enshrined these in their constitution. And, keep in mind that the reason they do this is to protect poor people. You want to make sure that poor people have rights to access, have access to education and health and water. And because if you're not poor, chances are you can get this anyway. But this is precisely where the system is breaking down. Let me just give you some examples. Take a country like Mali in Africa. Now, and the right, the right to education, and let's just look at access to education. We're not talking about learning or quality yet. You find that in Mali, just about everybody has access to primary school in the sense that they can start primary school, about 90 to 98%. But even if you take a very minimal figure like whether people are completing primary school, which is a requirement for access to secondary school, the rates diverge dramatically between rich and poor people. 67% of the richest quintile are finishing primary school, but only 23% of the poorest quintile are finishing primary school. And if you keep going down from after primary school to secondary school and tertiary, you get down to the single digits. So the very people that those rights, those universal rights were aimed at protecting are the ones who are not getting access to education. Now, this is just access. This is simply whether the kids are graduating from school or finishing school. If you start looking at learning outcomes, it's actually worse. And let's take a country like India. Now, India is sort of celebrated as this big success story in education with the high-tech industry, software, Bangalore, and Silicon Valley, and everything else. But in a country, and GDP was growing at 7–8% during the 2000s, and yet learning outcomes in rural India, and by rural India, I'm talking about 500 million people, right. The learning outcomes in rural India, first of all, are extraordinarily low. It's something like 50% of the children at grade 5 could read at a second grade level. Basically, only 50% could read a paragraph in their local language. And this number is declining. It's gone from 50% in the public schools. It's gone from 50% to 40%. Right? This is quite distressing. You keep in mind this country is growing at 7–8% a year, and the learning outcomes are declining, particularly in the public schools. And as most of you know, this problem is also in the MENA region. These PISA scores, which are trying to get comparable scores across countries, no country in the MENA region achieves even at the median of the global scores in PISA. But what's also distressing, but it's similar to what I just observed in India, is that the learning outcomes don't seem to have much to do with GDP per capita. You have low learning outcomes in Qatar as well as in Tunisia. And all of the learning outcomes in the MENA region seem to be underpredicted by their per capita income. in contrast to countries like Tunisia, like Vietnam and Singapore, where the learning outcomes are overpredicted by their per capita income. Now, when you go from education, remember I said there were education, there was health, there was water. If you go to health, actually the situation is even worse. But I want to show you one particular set of countries among African countries where the situation is critical. And that is the oil-producing countries in sub-Saharan Africa, of which now there are going to be more, since there are all these oil discoveries in the eastern continent. And you just look at immunization rates, child immunization rates, and you have a country like Gabon or Equatorial Guinea. Gabon has a per capita income of $10,000, but has the second lowest child immunization rate in Africa. It has a lower immunization rate than Togo or Eritrea, which are countries with a per capita income of $500. There's something really wrong going on here. Right? And I'm going to come back to the oil countries in a minute. But then let me turn to water. As I said, the right to water is enshrined in many constitutions or in laws and regulations. And yet, no city in South Asia, no city in India has 24/7 water. And really, if you don't have water 24/7, you actually don't have clean water. Because if there's an interruption in the water supply, all sorts of impurities enter the supply, and then it's impossible to get it out. What this shows you is a graph showing you the number of hours of water a day. That's the blue bar that are available. And you can see that they're of the order of 8-9 hours a day, so about a third of the day. But what's interesting is on the red bar is the supply of water in liters per capita per day. And you find that the availability of water, the number of hours per day, has nothing to do with the availability of water. So you take, let's see if I can use this cool pointer. Oops. No, better not. You take a city like Bathinda, which has 8 hours of water at 106 liters per capita per day. And you go up to a city like Derabasi in the middle, which also has 8 hours of water per day, but has 173 liters. And you go up to Goa at the top, which also only has 8 hours of water per day, at 341 liters. And Paris is not an Indian city. I don't know if Francois is getting a little worried. Not yet, at least. Paris has 24 hours of water per day at only 150 liters. It's about the average of all of these cities. So what's going on here? Well, because water is necessary for life, I mean, that's the reason why people have put it into their constitutions. Governments decide that they need to subsidize water or even give it out for free, so they underprice it. But when they underprice it, this means that politicians are able to control the water utility, because that's where the subsidy comes from. I mean, they're the ones who give the subsidy. And they then decide where the water pipes go, which is usually to their constituents or their political clients. And that may not be where the poor are. And since we know that you need water for life, poor people are usually buying water from water vendors, private water vendors. So it's outside the system, outside the network, at 5 to 16 times the meter rate. As somebody said, it's very expensive being poor. So the people that we were trying to protect are the ones who are losing out on the system, which has been captured by the non-poor. And if you don't believe me, you can look at this cartoon where the politician is saying, elect me and I promise to give you free water. And the poor farmer is saying, we never got the free water, we'd rather pay for it. You think about it, if you can even double or triple the meter rate and get this water to these poor people, they're better off, even though they are because they're paying so much more for their own water. Now, what's going wrong here? What's happening? So I'm going to now go out on a limb and say, I think we made a big mistake. When we have these rights in our Constitution, this is social justice, right? Universal access to education, universal access to healthcare, universal access to water. We immediately jump to the conclusion that the government should finance and provide that education and water and health care. But we forget that governments have limited resources and limited capacity. I'm going to get to the capacity in a minute, but let's just talk about the resources. I mean, every government, as we know, including this one here in this country, has limited resources. And then we have a theory in economics that tells us what to do with limited resources when governments have limited resources. When governments have limited resources, they should spend on two things. And only those two things. They should be financing public goods and goods with externalities, because that's what the private sector will not provide. Or they should be spending on redistribution, and redistribution to the poor. But in fact, when you say it has to be, that universal health or universal education has to be financed by the government, you're mixing up private goods and public goods. And once you do that, once you say government is going to finance all of health or all of education, you're financing private goods, and those private goods are worth a lot even to the non-poor. They're getting something for free, and since they have political power, they're going to grab it. And when they grab it, there's much less left over for the public goods and redistribution that the poor need. And just give you an example. Look at healthcare financing in India. Indian government spends about 3-4% of GDP on public financing of health. And if you look at who benefits from it, something like 33% of healthcare spending goes to the richest 20% of the population, and less than 8%, or about 8%, goes to the poorest 20%. Now you can see what's going on here, why that number is so big. It's because the big ticket item is hospitals. Those are very expensive. Now what's the story with hospitals? Well, the reason they have these hospitals, these public hospitals, is that there isn't a universal health insurance system. And everybody, rich and poor alike, need catastrophic health care. You always might get a heart attack or some debilitating disease, and you need high-cost care when you get that illness. And so if the government says, I'm going to provide free public hospitals, and I'm a rich person, I still want to make sure that I get access to that hospital if I have a heart attack. And since richer people have more political power, they make sure these hospitals are located near where they live, typically in urban areas. And so you see a concentration of hospitals in urban areas or in wealthier areas, and very little in rural areas. Now, you notice that primary health clinics are much more evenly distributed, the spending on primary health clinics, but we'll get back to what that really means in a minute. But let me turn to education, because I think the same thing goes on with education, and I think John Romer alluded to this yesterday, which is if you look at education, and this is the case of Indonesia, what you find is that primary spending is slightly progressive, actually, because richer people send their children to private primary schools, more of them, and poorer people have more children, so they actually have more consumption of primary public spending. But if you look at university spending, tertiary spending, it's hugely skewed towards the richest decile of the population. And this is a big ticket item. The sum of those two is actually bigger than what's spent on the poorest deciles. And what's going on here? Well, if you give free higher education, free university education free, prestigious university education, high quality university education, this is worth a whole lot, right? So, since you have to ration it, if it's free, they have an entrance exam that you have to qualify for in order to get into that free university. And the richer people are the ones who are able to send their children to better secondary schools in order to pass the exam to get into the university. And the end result is that this attempt at social justice of protecting poor people in their access to higher education is completely backfiring. And it's the non-poor who are benefiting from it, and the poor are left out. Okay. Now let me turn to the second problem. I said that when you have governments having to provide and finance these services, that they have limited resources, and you see what happens when they have limited resources. But the other problem is they have limited capacity. And when I say limited capacity, I mean two things. Governments are often unable to monitor that spending, and secondly, they have difficulty holding providers accountable. And you see this problem throughout the world. Just give you an example from Africa. Remember I said that at least primary health spending is more evenly distributed than tertiary care spending. Well, the problem is that spending often doesn't reach the primary health clinic. We've done studies of leakage rates of non-wage spending in primary health. This is, again, a sample from Africa. And you take a country like Chad, and you find that 99% of the spending on primary health clinics leaks before it reaches the clinic. Less than 1% actually gets to the clinic. And if you think about it, this actually makes sense, because this is mostly drugs and pharmaceuticals. Now, drugs and pharmaceuticals have two characteristics. One is that they're worth a lot in the private market, and secondly, they're easy to steal. You just put it in your pocket and you walk out. So, they get stolen and sold in the private market with very little left for the poor people for whom this was intended. The idea was we wanted to give free drugs to poor people because they couldn't afford it, because they're poor, and they're the ones who are missing out on these drugs. But it's actually more complicated than that, because even when you get the money to the clinic or the school, the government is often unable to hold the providers accountable. So we've done studies of teacher absenteeism in India. And you find that on average, about 25% of the time, the teacher is absent. And it ranges from about 16 to about 60 to about 40%. Now, this problem is actually worse than that, because the teachers, and I think you know what these teachers are doing. I mean, they're doing work in the private sector. But the interesting thing is that they're able to keep their jobs. How is that? Even if they don't show up, they keep their jobs. Well, teachers in many of these districts are also the ones who run the campaigns of the local political officials. So you see, this is a cozy equilibrium where the teacher runs the campaign, the politician gets elected, and in return, the politician gives the teacher a job for which he doesn't have to show up. And these two are in equilibrium, and the people who lose out are the poor people, for the ones for whom those rights and social justice was intended. Let me skip this. The problem is just as bad on health. The absentee rates of doctors in India is even higher than teachers in schools. They're absent on average about 40% of the time, and again, it ranges to about 67% of the time. And again, you know why. The doctors are doing private practice. So they don't show up in their clinic hoping that the patients will come to their private practice and actually pay for the service. And it's particularly acute in the poorer areas of the country. And just to give you one idea, This is also a problem in the MENA region. Indeed, even in this country, right? We've done similar surveys of doctors. In Egypt, the absentee rate's about 32% for health facility staff. As one woman put it when they were doing some consultations in health in Egypt, you can go to the private clinic and lose your money, or go to the public clinic and lose your life. Right? This is the choice that people are being faced with. Yes, perfect. Houston, we have a problem, right? A serious problem in trying to implement social justice in this setting where by making the mistake, and I call it a mistake, that government should finance and provide everything, we're actually allowing the system to be captured by the non-poor at the expense of the poor. But what can you do? Now, the thing is, it would be easy. I could sit down and list 100 different things we can do, technical solutions. You know, and people have tried it, and I've tried it. You know, we have things like you give bonuses to teachers for showing up in class, and you have the children take a photograph of the teacher and with a date stamp on it and send it. And they've done randomized control trials to show that these things work. You could give people vouchers to choose between public and private schools and things like that, all of which are really important. But if the system is captured, you also will face resistance. Because these people who have captured the system they're smarter than we are. And they will make sure that their rents aren't undermined. Just to give you one anecdote, so we introduced in Rajasthan, in India, we had this great idea. We were going to introduce time stamp machines for nurses. So when they come in to work, they have to stamp their card, and that way you can have a record of whether they were showing up at the clinic. And, you know, as usual, we had a randomized control trial. The MIT JPAL people were involved and everything else. And the whole thing was going to start with a control group and a treatment group. It was going to start on a Monday. On the Sunday before, all the machines were vandalized. Right? That's what I mean by, you know, you can come up with the best ideas, but they will outsmart you. So I'm frustrated because I think these are great solutions that don't seem to work. But I think what we need to do is to address the politics frontally. And by that I mean that it's still the case that a majority of the people are losing out on the system, which is the poor, as I showed you. So I think one thing we can do is actually empower them with information so they can bring some pressure to bear on the system. I mean, one feeling I get is that poor people are not necessarily thinking that this is a failure of public policy. They think of this as just being poor. It's just life is terrible when you're poor. And the fact that the teacher is absent or the doctor is not there is just part of that life. Rather than that it is a fundamental failure of public policy. And just give you one anecdote on that. I did a village immersion program in Western India, in Gujarat. Lived with a poor woman and worked with her and cooked with her and everything else. It was magnificent. And her kid was sick. And she took the kid to a private clinic. I think the guy was a quack. So I asked her, why didn't you take him to the free public clinic? And she looked at me like some idiot, you know. I didn't tell her that I had just done the World Development Report on service delivery. And she said, well, the doctor is never there. So I said, well, why do you think the doctor is never there? And that's when her answer really struck home. She said, oh, it's because the rains didn't come this year. See, so she thinks of the fact that the doctor is not there as a failure of an exogenous shock, failure of life, rather than a real failure of politicians to deliver to the poor. And so if I could, I got 3 minutes, right? So let me just give you very quickly an example where this can make a difference. So we did one of these public expenditure tracking surveys where we looked at the leakage rates in primary education in Uganda. This is back in the mid-1990s. And we asked the question, how much of the money that was intended for the primary schools actually arrives at the school? And the answer was 13%. And so this was distressing. The interesting thing is that the government of Uganda actually did one thing, which is they published this number. They put it in the newspapers, they put it on the radio, they put it on billboards, everywhere. The people started demanding. When they saw this, they said, okay, how much money is coming to my district? So this newspaper had to publish how much money was coming to the local district every month. When they found out how much money was coming in every month, they went to the school principal and said, hey, now I see how much money you're getting. How come my kid says there's no chalk in the classroom, there are no textbooks and things like that? So the school now has to publish the budget on the schoolroom door to this day. And this number went from 13% to 90% in 5 years. Right? So no fancy World Bank project or JPAL randomized control trial, just get the information out there. Finally, this is not going to be enough. And I want to come back to this profound problem of the oil-rich or resource-rich countries, like Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, where you had the second lowest immunization rate in Africa at a per capita income of $10,000. Now, what's going on there is quite simply that the money is going directly from the oil companies to the government without passing through the citizens. So it's much easier for that government to get away with whatever it's doing with that money. I think I know, but it's certainly not being spent on immunizing children. So we asked the question, what if you just took a small amount of this money and gave it out as cash? And you gave it out as cash to everybody, so you don't worry about targeting. Just lump sum to the whole population of Gabon. Right? Of course, since it's the same amount to everybody, it's a bigger share of the income of the poor, so it is a progressive transfer. And what we found just really quite surprised me, which is that just by getting 10% of that oil revenue out to everybody, you can eliminate poverty in Gabon and Equatorial Guinea twice over, if you look at the depth of poverty. So there's tremendous potential, and I think it goes back to what Marc Fleurbet was saying yesterday. Giving poor people the choice. Instead of forcing them to consume free education and free healthcare, which of course they don't seem to be getting anyway, you give them the cash and give them the choice of what to buy. Has tremendous power. It again empowers them and makes them active participants in the quest for social justice. Thanks.